The moment systems fail, it will not begin with noise. It will begin with silence. Power grids don't scream when they collapse. They simply stop responding. Air conditioning units go still, refrigerators hum their final cycle, communication networks stall under sudden overload. And within hours, the modern environment that once buffered every human need becomes hostile. Heat accumulates where it shouldn't. Cold seeps in where insulation fails. Air quality deteriorates without filtration. And the most dangerous factor of all begins to unfold quietly. Exposure. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but slow physiological breakdown driven by temperature, moisture, and time. Most people imagine survival as a movement, escaping, running, finding resources. But in reality, the first decisive act of survival is containment, the creation of a controlled microenvironment, and almost no one is prepared for how to do it correctly. When infrastructure disappears, the human body is immediately thrust back into a primitive negotiation with thermodynamics. Core temperature must remain within a narrow band around 37 degrees Celsius. Deviate just a few degrees, and enzymatic processes begin to fail. Blood thickens or thins improperly. Cognitive function deteriorates long before physical collapse is obvious. Yet the environments people find themselves in, urban apartments, vehicles, open terrain, are engineered for stability only under power conditions. Without active systems, these spaces rapidly equalize with external conditions. In heat, indoor temperatures can exceed outdoor levels due to trapped radiation. In cold, structures bleed warmth through conduction and air exchange. The misconception is that walls protect. In reality, without active control, walls often accelerate loss. Most survival advice focuses on stockpiling supplies or identifying evacuation routes, but this overlooks a critical constraint. Movement increases exposure. Every step taken without environmental control increases caloric expenditure, fluid loss, and risk of injury. The overlooked principle is that survival in the first 24 to 72 hours is not about reaching somewhere else. It is about stabilizing where you are. This is where the emergency shelter technique emerges, not as a structure in the traditional sense, but as a system of energy management. It is not about building something large or visible. It is about reducing the volume of air your body must regulate and minimizing the pathways through which heat and moisture escape. The misunderstanding that dominates most people's thinking is scale. They assume safety requires space, that comfort equates to survival. But from a thermodynamic perspective, larger spaces are liabilities. The more air volume present, the more energy is required to heat or cool it. In an unpowered scenario, that energy can only come from two sources: your body or the environment, and the environment is rarely cooperative. The hidden science here is deceptively simple. Survival shelters are not about protection from the outside. They are about controlling gradients, temperature gradients, humidity gradients, airflow gradients. Every uncontrolled gradient is a drain on the body's limited reserves. Consider the principle of convective heat loss. Air moving across the skin strips away the thin insulating boundary layer your body naturally generates. Even a slight draft can double the rate of heat loss in cold conditions. Conversely, in extreme heat, stagnant air prevents sweat from evaporating efficiently, reducing the body's ability to cool itself. The emergency shelter technique addresses both by creating a microclimate where airflow is intentionally restricted but not entirely eliminated. This balance is rarely discussed because it requires precision. Too much sealing and carbon dioxide accumulates. Too much ventilation and thermal control is lost. The margin for error is narrow, and most improvised shelters fail because they ignore this balance. Evidence from disaster scenarios consistently reinforces this. In urban blackouts, individuals who remain in large, open rooms experience faster onset of heat stress compared to those who confine themselves to smaller, shaded spaces. In cold weather survival incidents, victims found in compact, insulated environments, even improvised ones, show significantly higher survival rates than those who attempted to maintain larger living areas. The data is not anecdotal, it is physiological. Smaller volumes stabilize faster. They require less energy to maintain. They reduce exposure pathways. Yet this runs counter to instinct, which pushes people to spread out, to seek space, to avoid confinement. The technique itself begins with a shift in perception. You are not building a shelter around you. You are building a system around your body. The goal is to reduce the environmental load your body must counteract. This means that identifying materials not for their structural strength, but for their thermal properties. Fabrics, plastics, even paper, all become tools for manipulating heat transfer. Conduction, convection, radiation, each must be addressed. Ground contact becomes critical, as conductive heat loss to the earth can rapidly drain body warmth. Elevation, even by a few centimeters, can significantly reduce this loss. Similarly, reflective surfaces can redirect radiant heat back toward the body, a principle used in emergency blankets but often misapplied when airflow is not controlled. What most people overlook is moisture. The human body continuously releases water vapor through respiration and perspiration. In a sealed environment, this moisture accumulates, increasing humidity. High humidity in cold conditions accelerates heat loss by reducing the insulating effectiveness of clothing and increasing conductive transfer. In hot conditions, it impairs evaporative cooling, pushing the body toward heat exhaustion. The emergency shelter technique incorporates controlled venting, not large openings but micro vents strategically placed to allow moisture escape without significant thermal exchange. This is not intuitive. It requires understanding how air behaves in confined spaces, how warm air rises, how pressure differences drive movement even in still environments. As conditions worsen, the margin for error narrows further. In a prolonged outage or collapse scenario, external conditions may become unpredictable. Temperature swings, precipitation, contamination of air or water sources. The shelter must adapt without being rebuilt entirely. This is where modular thinking becomes critical. Layers can be added or removed, openings adjusted, insulation increased or decreased. The shelter becomes a dynamic system rather than a static structure. And this adaptability is what determines long-term survival, not initial construction. The escalation is subtle but relentless. The longer the external systems remain offline, the more the environment asserts itself. Day-night cycles become more pronounced without artificial regulation. Urban heat islands intensify during the day and cool rapidly at night, creating thermal stress cycles. Without proper sheltering, the body is forced to continuously adapt, expending energy reserves that cannot be easily replenished. Fatigue sets in, decision-making degrades, and small mistakes compound into critical failures. The shelter, if properly constructed and managed, acts as a buffer against this escalation, flattening the extremes into a manageable range. But the most critical implications is psychological. A controlled environment reduces cognitive load. When the body is not under constant thermal stress, the mind can focus on planning, on resource management, on situational awareness. Without this stability, even the most well-prepared individual can deteriorate rapidly. The emergency shelter technique is not just about physical survival. It is about preserving the capacity to think, to adapt, to respond, and yet, despite its importance, it remains largely absent from mainstream preparedness discussions, not because it is hidden, but because it is misunderstood. It does not rely on specialized equipment or complex engineering. It relies on principles that are simple but counterintuitive, requiring a shift away from conventional thinking about space, comfort, and protection. As the situation evolves, as external conditions become more hostile and resources more scarce, the difference between those who understand this system and those who do not becomes increasingly stark. Because the next phase is where most improvised shelters fail, not in their construction, but in their maintenance under changing conditions. And that is where the real test begins. The failure does not announce itself when it begins. It manifests gradually, almost imperceptibly, as the internal conditions of the shelter begin to drift away from equilibrium. Temperature edges upward or downward by a degree at a time. Air becomes heavier, more humid, or paradoxically too dry. Surfaces that were once neutral begin to feel damper and brittle. These are not minor inconveniences. They are early indicators that the balance between the body and its constructed environment is breaking down. And once that balance shifts beyond a narrow threshold, the shelter ceases to function as protection and instead becomes a multiplier of stress. The danger at this stage is not external exposure, but internal miscalibration. Most individuals, even those who manage to create an initial micro-shelter, fail to monitor and adjust it dynamically. They treat it as a static solution, assuming that once enclosed they are safe. But the reality is that the human body is a continuous source of heat and moisture, and the external environment is constantly changing. The shelter exists at the intersection of these forces, and without deliberate regulation, it will drift toward instability. The critical mistake is assuming that stability is the default state. Expenditure. The shelter becomes not just a barrier, but a responsive system, one that works with the body rather than against it. The implications for survival are profound. In a prolonged emergency, resources such as food and water become critical, but their utility is directly tied to the body's ability to maintain homeostasis. A person in a stable microenvironment requires fewer calories, loses less water, and maintains cognitive function longer than someone exposed to fluctuating conditions. The shelter, therefore, is not just a protective measure. It is a force multiplier, extending the effectiveness of every other resource available. But this level of control introduces a new challenge: attention. Maintaining a dynamic shelter requires constant awareness, periodic adjustments, and an understanding of subtle environmental cues. Fatigue, stress, and uncertainty all work against this. The longer the situation persists, the harder it becomes to sustain the level of engagement required. This is where most systems begin to degrade, not because they are poorly designed, but because they are not maintained with the necessary precision. And this is where the next layer of the technique emerges, one that moves beyond immediate survival into sustained resilience. Because eventually the question's no longer how to survive the first 72 hours, but how to endure the days and weeks that follow without external support. The shelter must evolve from a reactive construct into a semi-stable habitat, capable of buffering not just immediate threats, but prolonged environmental thought. And that transformation requires a deeper understanding of materials, structure, and energy flow, principles that are rarely considered until it is too late, but which determine whether the shelter remains an asset or becomes a liability as conditions continue to deteriorate.